This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing knowledge and study of modern Israel. I am your host, Gilad Halpern, and my guest today is a professor of European history at the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom. She is now in Israel to participate in an international workshop organized by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Leer Institute, and it is entitled Nationalism in the History of the Holocaust, Genocide and Mass Violence, and her paper explores the so-called war before wars, the clashes and violence that took place in the Balkans in the immediate run-up to the First World War. Professor Cathie Carmichael, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Oh, hello, Gilad. Thank you very much for inviting me today.
So, when the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo in June 1914, the shot was famously described as one that was heard around Europe. But it hardly surprised Europe, because much of their attention had already been set on the ongoing unrest in the Balkans, especially in what would later become Yugoslavia.
Well, that's true and not true. I think it did surprise the European reading public, who felt very sorry, I think, for what had happened. They felt a great deal of pity for Franz Ferdinand, but particularly for his children. He left small children. His wife was also killed. So there was a lot of compassion for them, and then anger. And it was directed against the Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was occupied annexed by the Habsburgs in 1908. And they became the focus of public anger, this community of Orthodox Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also the Serbs living over the border, because the assassins had made this journey from Belgrade they meandered through Serbia and then Bosnia to get to Sarajevo. They'd obviously been helped at some stage along the way. So there was a sense of not only their guilt for the assassination, Gavrilo Princip and the others, but also the guilt of people who'd helped them, frontier guardsmen and so on, hadn't checked their bags or had let them through with arms. So it created this sense, particularly in Austria-Hungary, but perhaps also in the rest of Europe, that Serbia was a rogue state. It was a state that had harboured terrorists and therefore wasn't to be trusted.
And that came as a surprise? That wasn't the notion? The Serbs weren't the bad guys before June 1914?
Well, the Serbs had been playing the part of bad guys for a while, because they'd previously been at war in 1912 and 1913, and the Austro-Hungarian public had read a lot of stories about wartime atrocities, and so they had this notion that Serbs were rather cruel, and particularly these armed bandits, the so-called komitadžis. So they already had a notion of the Serb people as being inclined towards violence.
Mm-hmm. What were the origins? What can you tell us about the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913? Who was fighting who and why?
Well, the Balkan Wars are perhaps one of the last episodes of the Eastern Question, where the Ottoman possessions in Europe are taken by newly emerging Balkan powers. So it's really about the Ottoman Empire losing its last toehold in Europe. And so,
that was the late 19th century, right?
No, this is 1912, 1913.
Oh, so the Ottomans were still there in 1912?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they still retained a part of Europe around Edirne, Adrianople. So a small amount of the Ottoman Empire remained in Europe. But this is the time when you see the formation of new states. Albania is created in 1912. So it's really those Balkan states picking over what's left of the Ottoman Empire and enlarging themselves. This is when Serbia gets Kosovo. And Kosovo, of course, has a Serbian minority, but it's a minority and it's a very mixed population. And of course, a lot of these areas that are taken by Serbia have Muslim populations as well. So it's an important war, but what the European reading public focus on, partly because of this Carnegie Commission report, which comes out just before the First World War, is the number of interethnic atrocities. So mass hangings, really gruesome details. There's lots of rumours circulating in the Austrian press. There's a diplomat that disappears and then he re-emerges, but in the time when he's missing, there's all these stories about what's happened to him. So there's a lot of panic in the Austrian press before the First World War.
And were the Serbs the most powerful ethnic group in that scheme of affairs?
In the Austro-Hungarian imagination, yes. But you've also got to remember that over 40% of the population of Bosnia and Herzegovina at this time are Orthodox. So many of them identify with Serbia as a state or Montenegro as a state. So it's not a very clear-cut border. It's also a border which is easy to traverse. So you've got a very, very long border between Austria-Hungary and Serbia and between Austria-Hungary and Montenegro, but it's very easy to cross. That's why people like border guardsmen are regarded with suspicion. Are they really guarding the border? So it's a very difficult territorial situation, I'd say. And it's possible that Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg monarchy, want to increase its territory at the expense of Serbia as well. Because what we can see is the Balkan Wars have been a big land grab with Serbia expanding and other states expanding. And perhaps the fact that so many borders have been redrawn is tempting for the Habsburg monarchy as well. So
what we see here is basically the same kind of dynamic that we saw in later years within the Yugoslav state and later in the Balkan Wars. Is this really, somewhat expansionist Serbian state or entity, and other groups around them trying to resist them?
There are, but I think it's slightly perilous to draw too many contemporary parallels, or parallels with the 1990s, or even with the Second World War, because what we see at the beginning of the First World War with this Austro-Hungarian invasion of Serbia is atrocities committed by the Habsburg troops against Serb civilians, and thousands of people are killed within the first few weeks of the war. So it's not unproblematic, a sort of victim perpetrator. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and of course a huge number of Serbs died during the First World War, as well as citizens, subjects of Austria-Hungary as well. So I do think it's very important for what happens later. One of the things that the First World War does is make the establishment of a Yugoslav state all the more difficult, because what happens when Yugoslavia is established in 1918 is the state comes together, but its former combatants, so people who were on different sides of the war, come together in a single state. And in my view, that's a fatal flaw for the new Yugoslavia. It simply can't overcome the legacy of the First World War, that suspicion between those people who'd been in the Habsburg monarchy and those who hadn't.
But those who had been in the Habsburg monastery, how loyal were they to Vienna?
Some of them were. It depended on personal inclination, how nationalist one felt. Some South Slavs were incredibly loyal to the Emperor Franz Josef. So when he died in 1916, that was a big turning point, because that seemed to be that was an end of an era. He'd been emperor for so long. Others felt very much drawn to the Yugoslav project, the South Slav project. So it really depends. I mean, you do have this phenomenon of people changing sides, so they'll go and fight for the other side during the war.
During the war? So they started off fighting for the Austrians, and
they joined the Serbs, yeah.
What can you tell us about them? I mean, how significant were they?
Traditionally seen this as a weakness in the Habsburg monarchy, because you have a phenomenon of also soldiers trying to avoid active service. That's not to say that a lot of soldiers weren't incredibly brave and fought with real commitment to the regime, but you do have this phenomenon of people, men wanting to try and avoid the front, escorting prisoners of war, and 20 men would volunteer to escort a prisoner of war away from the battle. You've got men shooting themselves or breaking their limbs so that they don't have to fight. So we can see as the war develops, it's not always a very willing army, which of course is a problem for a state. If you have a state that doesn't have a willing army, then how can it continue? So you have pockets of, let's say, disloyalty towards the Habsburg state.
Right, but we're talking about local troops here. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire, being such a huge country, invested much of its effort in the very early stages of the war on the Balkan front.
There's an enormous network of garrisons along the Serbian and Montenegrin frontier.
So even those who were brought from other parts of the empire were unwilling troops, as it were? Yeah, so it didn't have to do... Okay, so my question here, it didn't have to do specifically with any sort of South Balkan or Southeastern European nationalism, but it's rather disbelief in the state or...
A crumbling belief. You have a problem, for example, when the front opens with Italy, with Italian speakers not wanting to fight against Italians. So yes, you do have this phenomenon, but it's an enormously powerful military state, and there are, as I say, this network of garrisons with thousands of men in them. So it's difficult to say that there were patterns of disloyalty.
So with the outbreak of the First World War, the wars of 1912 and 1913 being in such close proximity, were fresh in their mind. You mentioned all the gruesome reports that had been reported in the Austrian press and elsewhere as well. When Franz Ferdinand went to Sarajevo, was the prospect of being assassinated by a Serb nationalist a real one? Did he take a risk, and wittingly or not?
He took a risk, but I think he knew what the risk was. The personal gains for him were very great, potentially, as well. And I think he underestimated the risk. He was very angry, of course, because there was an attempt to there was a bomb thrown at his car, and it missed, and he arrived famously to the greeting party and lost his temper and said, "What kind of welcome party is this?" But then he had a sense of duty and wanted to go and visit a wounded soldier in hospital. And it was the second journey where the car stalled on this pavement near a bridge in Sarajevo, and that moment of the car stalling and trying to change direction, Gavrilo Princip was standing on the pavement and shot, and he'd been practicing shooting all summer, so he was very good. And he shot Franz Ferdinand in the carotid artery because he had a bulletproof vest on, but of course it wasn't protecting him.
But what was the anti-Austrian sentiment in Sarajevo palpable?
No, the pro-Austrian sentiment in Sarajevo was palpable, and there were riots afterwards, and Serb property was destroyed. There was a big hotel in the centre of the city which was gutted, and contemporaries compared it to a pogrom. So if you can imagine a lot of wanton damage against Serb property, people felt angry. It was that moment of anger which was very strong, I think.
What were the Ottomans thinking to themselves at that time, looking at what had been their backyard up until very recently?
Are you thinking that perhaps they want to regain territory?
I don't know. They saw the one regional power fighting against an emergent nationalist movement that they had suffered from until very recently. What were the assessment of that situation?
Well, that's an interesting question, because there's a lot of refugees from the recent wars, in the recent Balkan wars, living in Anatolia, and they become quite a sort of vocal minority after this, and they're rather important in the war mobilization and also the subsequent attacks on the Armenian community. So I think it has a ricochet effect in the Ottoman Empire. But, I mean, this is rather a generalisation, but they tend to then turn inwards towards changing the ethnic composition of the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia itself. I'm not saying that the Armenians suffer from the brunt of the frustration of these refugees from the Balkan Wars, but that's part of...
But the Ottomans would also later be on the same side as the Austrians in the First World War.
That's right, they entered the war.
Yeah, so were they ever considering, crushing the Balkans from both sides?
That's something that some of their politicians hope for.
Mm-hmm.
But also you have to remember they were potentially defending themselves against Imperial Russia, which had its war aims to take a lot of...
because of the focus of the war shifted to other fronts pretty quickly.
It did, yes.
So how long did the actual war in the First World War in the Balkans, Austria against Serbia, actually last?
Well, initially Austria-Hungary was defeated and had to withdraw, and then tried to concentrate their war effort against the Russian Empire. And that was a real weakness for the Habsburg monarchy, that it was fighting on different fronts. But then
We're still talking about 1914 there?
They were defeated in 1914. They retook Serbia and Montenegro and occupied it for the rest of the war, but then lost it, of course, at the end of the war, and lost their empire as well, which was then carved into the various successor states, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and so on. Mm-hmm. So they had defeat and then victory and then defeat, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So what did it, after they took Serbia and Montenegro for the rest of the war, what was the Serb nationalist insurgency defeated?
Yes,
yeah. And it never re-emerged.
Large portions of the Serbian state go into exile at this time. There's a big retreat of the Serbian army. One of the reasons why the Yugoslav declaration, the declaration of intent of creating the Yugoslav state, takes place in Corfu is that's where people have evacuated themselves to. Serbia is completely under Central European control.
So when Austria-Hungary is defeated in the war and dissolves, and the Yugoslav state is formed with
a Serbian king.
Exactly, a Serbian king
Alexander
and Serbian prevalence in really every aspect, every walk of life. If you want.
That's what was said. I think Karađorđević himself, Alexander, was quite careful about trying to create a state of the nationalities. I think he wasn't overly concerned about either the Bosnian Muslims or the Kosovo Albanians, but he certainly wanted some kind of cultural, at least, for Slovenes and Croats and Serbs.
Does that give a fresh impetus to Serbian nationalists, seeing that as historic justice?
I think they did see it as historic justice, but in a sense, they saw it as a reward for their bravery during the war. And Karađorđević himself had been a soldier king, so they saw that as their, I suppose, the right of conquest, although it wasn't quite as straightforward as that. It certainly gave them a sense of their own legitimacy in 1918. And Karađorđević, of course, became a dictator very quickly. He dissolved parliament and started to rule Yugoslavia through personal rule very soon after the creation of Yugoslavia, which created this fatal flaw, really, and he was assassinated himself in 1934 in Marseille when he was visiting France on an official visit. So the chasm between what Croats wanted in particular and what Serb nationalists wanted was there from the beginning, but exacerbated by his own personal abuse of power.
Mm-hmm. So I think the lesson here is, if you're a monarch, don't go to anywhere near Serbia.
Possibly, yes. This is an era of assassinations. There's a lot of assassinations. People tend to forget that, but there are a lot of politicians are killed in the run-up to the First World War, and even in the 20s and 30s.
My layman's notion is that the wars of 1912, 1913 are somewhat forgotten. Is it because I'm not a Balkan and not a historian?
I'm not sure whether that's true, but of course they're completely dwarfed by what happens next and the catastrophe of the First World War, and then of course the
no, but not just their extent, but also their historic importance, because as I understand your argument, you're saying is that they were a prelude to the First World War in some ways.
Yes, but also some kind of, in a nationalist sense, some kind of solution to the Eastern question. So they're the end of something and the beginning of something else.
Just like any other historic episode, which is why we love history so much. Professor Cathie Carmichael, Professor of European History at the University of East Anglia, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Our co-host, Dalia Shendlin, will be back with us shortly. But in the meantime, visit our website, like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And follow me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.